Welcome to the Baptist Review Podcast. I'm your host, David Sons, and this is our fourth interview with SBC President Bart Barber. And in this interview, Bart, we want to talk, I know in most of our interviews leading up to this, we've talked about kind of issues and structural things within the SBC. But in this interview, we want to talk about just the culture of the convention as a whole. And then kind of towards the very end, talk a little bit about
culture.
We do have culture. We're swimming in it. And at the very end, I want to talk a little bit about the annual meeting, about this year, about some things that maybe we can look forward to this year, things that might be changing or whatnot. But Griffin Gulledge is with me on this interview as well. And so, Griffin, thanks for being here and thanks for jumping back in.
Yeah, I'm glad to be part of the conversation. We have deep culture. We have barbecue. We have RAs and GAs, Adventures and Odyssey.
Glory and hallelujah.
Oh, amen. Adventures and Odyssey.
Yeah.
Great.
I mean, we have subculture.
So Bart, one of the things that I've noticed kind of happening, you are a much more credible Baptist historian than I am. This perhaps has been happening all throughout Baptist history, but really I've noticed it more recently, is this kind of growing number of virtual and kind of affinity-based associations, whereas at one point we kind of saw more local. I mean, you had to be an association of churches that were local to you because those were the churches that you knew and those were the churches that you lived near and they were in your community. But now, because of the world we live in, there is kind of more virtual or even affinity-based associations. I'm thinking Pillar Network, I'm thinking Nine Marks, Acme, the Conservative Baptist Network. Is growth of these kind of affinity-based networks, associations within the convention, is that a good thing for the SBC as a whole? And how do they kind of affect the future of regional or local associations?
I think you can identify it as, if not a totally new thing, something that is certainly accelerated because telecommunications technology has made this more feasible than other things. They're not all brand new. Acme's been around as long as the Roadrunner, and
true. That's true.
You should probably take that out of the podcast.
Well,
that may make somebody mad. Yeah. But
no, keep it in.
But I think it's neutral. I don't think it's helpful or harmful in and of itself for the convention. And honestly, anything that we do in the Southern Baptist Convention to build more relationships and connections with people has the potential of being something really good. The people I'm concerned about are not the people who have a robust network of friends. The people I'm concerned about are the ones who are just sitting on the outside, wondering if they belong anywhere at all. But certainly once those kinds of groups form, they have to decide that they want to be a part of the bigger group too. Yeah. And as long as they do that, I think it can be something that's very beneficial for the convention.
Yeah, Bart, one of the questions that, well, it's not in our list of questions we have here, but you're not a spring chicken to Baptist life. I wouldn't say that you're like a retirement age yet, but you've been around. What has changed in SBC culture? Like Martin Marty called Southern Baptists the Catholics of the South at one point. That's just not true anymore. And I'd like to hear you just reflect on the ways in which our broad subculture has changed, but then also the more internal dynamics of our convention have changed in the time that you've been involved in the SBC.
That's a broad question. I think that Southern Baptists, along with most other substantial, significantly large religious movements in the U.S., are affected by secular culture around us and always have been.
Sure.
As much as we affect this culture around us, at least, maybe more sometimes. And so if you take a look at what's happening in the secular culture around us, that people are becoming more isolated, more distrustful, more gullible in some ways. I preached about this last year at the annual meeting. What we find joy in sometimes is a good conspiracy theory or a takedown or some things that are really negative. And I think that that's something that has affected the culture of the Southern Baptist Convention. Social media has had a substantial effect on the culture of the of the actual meeting itself. We've had multiple times now that I could document that the Southern Baptist Convention thought one thing on Tuesday and another thing on Wednesday, and what changed in between was the social media discussion about what had happened on Tuesday that formed a new opinion in the messenger body on Wednesday.
The Confederate flag debate,
that's
for sure.
Perfect example of that.
Even probably the waiver of privilege.
The alt-right amendment,
yeah.
Waiver of privilege. Yeah, several of those things that we could point to that fall right into that camp. And
in some ways, the law amendment debate last year was heavily affected by social media.
In some ways, certainly everything's affected by social media now, but I'm talking about the phenomenon where social media
changes the perspective
during the
meeting. You see a change.
Not several months of social media leading up to the meeting, but during the meeting, the messenger body is informed and changes opinion based upon what's happening in social media. And some of that, I think, shows up in the way that people talk about the platform. Platform's a pejorative now, and some of that's because it's being pitted against an alternate source of truth about what's going on in the convention, and that alternate source of truth is social media.
Well, we all saw you cut the mics last year, so
gosh,
oh man,
I tell you, I need to go back and watch the video and see how many shades the color of my face changed when I realized that those microphones were not working.
I don't think it changed much. I think it was consistently dark red all the way through. But you said social media, but you were going on about ways about our convention's culture changing beyond that as well.
Sure. Our convention, there are 100 rabbit trails that I could go down with that. I'll say this, just something that I've personally written about and been concerned about for a long time. I think the convention's culture is a lot less Baptist than it used to be in some substantial ways. People, and this is no slight on any of my predecessors, because I know it's not true of all of my predecessors. I'm just making a general observation. People after the annual meeting came up to me, people who agree with me generally on stuff, disagree with me generally on stuff, and they said, wow, you conducted the meeting well, fairly. You really know Robert's Rules of Order. You seem to be really comfortable doing that. And I thought, I do this every 4 weeks. At First Baptist Church of Farmersville, we have business meetings that I conduct over and over again. And I think I'm not going to identify specific things, but I'll just say that there have been moments in our convention's recent history, by which I mean the last 30 years, where I've seen people who are very successful in their own church struggle to try to exert influence over the Southern Baptist Convention. And I think part of the reason is that they've been people who had very little exposure to congregationalism and had very little understanding of how it is that you conduct a meeting that's broadly congregational. Even people who don't like congregationalism in their own home church, when they're messengers of the convention, they want it to be congregational there.
There's a book that just came out called The Great De-Churching. I don't know if you've seen this. Michael Graham, I think Ryan Burge is involved in it, Jim Davis.
I'm familiar with it. I hope that I get to read books again starting June 13th.
The clock is ticking.
This sociological study says one of the things that's changed in our church culture is that
I'll tell you, I know you're trying to say something important, but one of the big changes in my life, having been elected president of the Southern Baptist Convention, is that tons of people send me books, and I have no time to read any of them anymore.
June is coming.
Yeah.
But in this book, they say that while it's still true among evangelicals and also Southern Baptists, that the majority of churches are under 100 people, they also conclude the majority of church goers attend churches that are over 250 people. And so as people are migrating to larger and larger churches, I would think that along with that would probably be diminished exposure to democratic processes and congregationalism and church business meetings, because the larger your churches get, it seems to be a trend that it's more top down, it's more staff led.
Yeah. And it's not only congregationalism; it's also the troubling gradual withdrawal from universal religious liberty that's happening in some quarters in the Southern Baptist Convention. Everyone named in the Baptist history book that you studied in seminary is rolling over in their graves every time someone who calls themselves a Baptist advocates for the establishment of Nicene theology as the theology of the state. So there's that movement away from Baptist thought. There are a number of ways that I think our culture is becoming more blandly evangelical and less Baptist. But I am encouraged by the way that there are movements gaining ground against that. I would give credit to the Nine Marks movement as a movement that is robustly Baptist and is advocating for that within our family of churches, and a few old codgers like me who are trying to promote that vision as well.
Bart, one of the common kind of complaints, and this is really from all sides, I think we talked about this maybe a little bit earlier, is that it seems to be that tribalism and infighting are kind of destroying or at least significantly hindering our ability to cooperate. I think we talked about this earlier, that the trust deficit that we see in the SBC, and perhaps maybe a more loyalty to a tribe of people than actually to the truth, or even if it may reflect poorly on us. And I think that would be something that most Southern Baptists would probably point to and say, hey, this is something that we see that we feel like is significantly hindering our ability to cooperate. I know one of the things that you've tried to do as president, you talked about this a minute ago, restoring trust, fairness in the annual meeting, ensuring that people, folks have the opportunity to be heard, even if the decision goes against them, they at least feel like they've had the opportunity to persuade the room. In what ways have you tried to counteract some of this kind of tribalism and infighting? And then maybe even just be reflective and say, are there things that you have done as president or led that you would say maybe even has contributed to that in some form or fashion?
I'm going to define what tribalism is first.
Okay, I think that's great.
There's not a thing wrong with you having your set of beliefs. And there's not a thing wrong with you connecting with people who believe similarly to you. And there's not a thing wrong with people you're connected with who believe similarly to you, articulating your beliefs or promoting them. And if that's what people mean by tribalism, I don't really see any problem with that. As long as those views are views that match up with who the Southern Baptist Convention is.
Sure, under the broader umbrella.
If you're the group of people who are trying to convince the Southern Baptist Convention to walk away from the Trinity, or to start sprinkling infants, or to abandon religious liberty, or to do some of these things that are core beliefs that aren't even just Southern Baptist beliefs, they're things that extend beyond us to the key markers of what it means to be Baptist, then, at that point, you probably would be more comfortable somewhere else, and I'd surely be comfortable with you somewhere else. But beyond that, just to have some differing views on things that fall within the Baptist faith and message and are compatible with who we are as Baptists. Nothing wrong with aligning with people and trying to promote your point of view. I think tribalism, as a pejorative, comes down to this. When you cannot conceive of or admit wrongs done by people on your team, or cannot conceive of or admit rights done, good things done by people who are on the other team, because it's all about what jersey somebody's wearing.
Not what are you for, but who are you with?
Yeah, and that kind of thing, I think, is very destructive for us as Southern Baptists, or even as Americans. I have tried. I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask about specific things if you want to that you think are ways that I've contributed to that. But I'll tell you, I've appointed people from the CBN to presidential appointments. I've appointed people from all sorts of different theological viewpoints to presidential appointments. I've been criticized for the ways that I've appointed people who don't agree with me about things to positions within the convention. And I have tried in interacting with people who believe differently than I have, even people that I just disagree profoundly with. I've tried to make it about the ideas and not about the people. And I think those things are important. You're not going to cure tribalism by telling people, well, you just can't believe what you believe, or you just can't talk about it.
Right. Sure.
Instead, it's got to be trying to establish some sort of a ground rule of civility in the way that we interact over our differences.
Now, Bart, I appreciate that, but I will say, I think that some of your critics would say that, well, for you, tribalism is really, it's when other people do it and not when you do it. And so let me bring up.
That's possible. I'll tell you, I'm human.
Well, of course. Of course. Let me give a couple of specific examples here. I'd love to hear what you have to say. I'll give a little background here. Dusty Devers has been a vocal critic of yours. I think Dusty would identify as a Christian nationalist. He certainly identifies as an abortion abolitionist and has been a vocal critic of the pro-life movement and of your writing on pro-life issues. Dusty is a pastor who recently ran for and won office as a state senator in Oklahoma. And in the course of that election, it came out that you had donated to his Republican primary opponent. And I think maybe some of the minor criticisms would say, Bart, that was petty. That was just like sort of petty slap at somebody that you don't really care for, whose positions you don't care for. Your worst critics would say this is the exact sort of divisive tribalism of like, I'm not just going to disagree with you, but I'm going to try and defeat you. Even though you're a Southern Baptist, I'm a Southern Baptist. When you hear those criticisms on that issue, how do you respond?
Well, that didn't come to anybody's knowledge because I revealed it. I could have gone to Oklahoma and spoken at campaign rallies for the pro-life conservative candidate that I gave a little bit of money to in that race, but I didn't do any of that. I just quietly, privately made a political contribution, and I don't think I'm the first president of the SBC to make a political contribution. I didn't try to make it personal. I didn't try to make it public. Other people are the ones who did that. I'll tell you this. After that primary election was done, Dusty was facing a pro-abortion Democrat, and I would have voted for Dusty if I'd been voting in that general election in that district. And I'm thankful that he won that election. But to make this discernible to people and to help people to understand how it's really not personal. And it's not tribal in the sense of who I'm with rather than what I'm for. Anytime I know of anyone who is seeking public office in the United States who is committed to having a Christian establishment of religion in the United States and wants to hold public office in the United States, if there is a pro-life, conservative, Republican option in a primary election, other than them, I'm likely to give that other candidate a little bit of money.
Okay.
Well, I'm just really committed to religious liberty, and that shouldn't surprise anybody. It's not about Dusty, because before I knew who Dusty was, I've been writing about religious liberty academically for 20 years. It's something that is very important to me, and I shouldn't think it would be surprising or scandalous that the president of the Southern Baptist Convention cares about what the Baptist faith and message articulates and is willing to support it.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, political donation in our country is a form of speech. It's not as if you're really doing anything
Thus
different.
saith the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and now, but you didn't give permission to his radical Democrat opponent to like use some of your online criticisms to bash Dusty. You weren't meeting at the DNC of Oklahoma saying, like, all right, let's get Dusty together.
No, nor would I in any way whatsoever. I like I said, once it got to that general election, I was supportive of Dusty as a candidate.
By that same token, one internal tribalistic fight in in the SBC has been over plagiarism. Recently, even the past couple of weeks as we're recording this, you guys might be listening at home a little later than when this has happened, but you'll recall the president of Harvard resigning in part over allegations of plagiarism in her doctoral thesis. Now, your predecessor, Ed Litton, was really dogged throughout his entire presidency because of not just allegations, but evidence of borrowed material from J.D. Greer. J.D. said that he gave him permission for some of that. And then, by other tokens, it seemed like at times Ed was sharing stories of personal experiences that didn't belong to him. Some would say that you just outright defended him. I've got your tweet in front of me when you did say there's a distinction. Plagiarism in academic writing sermons, you said, plagiarism is a man-made standard invented centuries later. It's not sinful in and of itself. It's only sinful if you're bound by some sort of obligation to an authority who requires you to do your work by this man-made standard. Now, others like David Schrock has written a book out of Founders Press, Brothers, We Are Not Plagiarists, where he argues that this is a form of stealing. It's a form of lying. At the very least, it's a form of false witness. And David makes some, I think, implications from that go extremely far. Like if you have a sermon prep team, you can't have anybody on it who's not an elder in your church. Probably a lot further than some of us with different polity are going to agree with. But I think the accusation against you is that you, knowing that Ed had done this, he's on your side. And so you came out and defended something that is, well, I guess what David and others have said. It's lying, it's stealing, it's false witness. Is that an example of tribalism and your contribution? I mean, what do we make of that whole fight, that whole debate?
I think if you'll go back and read carefully everything I wrote about that, I actually wound up saying that what Ed did, assuming, the evidence seems to be there that he did the things that they said he did, that I said that what Ed did was wrong. I didn't exonerate Ed at all. I was exonerating other people. And just a couple of things about that. There's a historian who has written about how Christianity down through the centuries has sort of swung back and forth between heavily intellectualized versions of Christianity and heavily emotional versions of Christianity. And I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, so, it's not Pentecostal. We're not handling snakes. Nobody's speaking in tongues.
But occasionally people clap.
But yeah, sure. It's a small country Southern Baptist church that was in many ways anti-intellectual. It was seen as a virtue if the pastor got up on Sunday morning and said, I don't really know where this sermon's going to go. We'll see what the Spirit leads it to be. I would get fired for that if I did that. There's a great
Michael Scott quote where he says, sometimes I start a sentence and I don't know where it's going. I just hope I find it along the way.
We're not listening to this guy's notes. We got God talking here.
They saw that as the direct movement of the Spirit on the pastor as he was preaching. And I think that we're at a point where, and honestly, although I have great appreciation for people who are part of the Reformed movement, I think Reformed Christianity tends to excel in times that are of heavily intellectualized Christianity. And the fact of the matter is, the whole idea that you could own words you said is a post-biblical development. It's a post-biblical idea that those are your property, the words that you said. And I think, and I'm fine with that. Somebody who's writing a song, Andrew Peterson ought to be able to own his work product. But I think it becomes more difficult when you are saying that all I'm doing is getting up here to proclaim to you the word of God, and then you're taking ownership of what you said was the word of God that you are proclaiming in front of people. I could not bring myself, I don't think, to copyright a book of sermons. And I just don't know how we take ownership of the gospel, how we take ownership of ideas and thoughts that have existed long before us. These are things that we were all discipled into. And at the very least, I think you ought to have to make a case for how you come to the conclusion that you can own those ideas and that they can become yours. And certainly, I just think there's an easily demonstrable difference between stealing someone's goat and stealing someone's sentence that they said last week. And so it still can be lying if you're telling a story as though you were in it, that you weren't, that wasn't a story about you. It's not about the fact that somebody else said that. It's about the fact that you said something that wasn't true.
But when Adrian Rogers says, if my bullet fits your gun, shoot it, or James Merritt says at the San Antonio convention in 2011, hey, if you like this sermon, go preach it at your church.
Yeah.
Is that something that we should agree to disagree on in the convention? Or is that something where we should say, you know what, actually, no, that was wrong.
I don't think
that's
it's
disqualifying for me.
I don't think it's wrong. And who I've got in mind when I'm trying to defend this, I'm in Senegal planting churches among people who don't know beeswax about the Bible or about theology. And I would love for them to have some seminary-educated pastor who could come in and do their own work in the original languages and whatever else. But that person does not exist there because those institutions do not exist there. And I'm not going to tell a church that I planted, you're going to have to wait 10 years before you can have preaching on Sunday morning. And so instead, what I'm doing is saying to church planters over there, let me show you some stuff that you can say that will proclaim the word and will instruct your congregation. And let me also be teaching you how to pray through and learn and develop some of these things on your own. And the gospel can flourish without PhDs in theology standing around somewhere. And I just think there's a need to push back against this over-intellectualization of church work. And even here in the U.S., I know some guys whose strength as a pastor lies not in their preaching and in their academic development of their sermons and whatever else, who aren't lying to anybody. They're not breaking any kind of a contract to their church. When they come up on a Sunday morning and say, I'm preaching a series of sermons through this book, and it's clear that they're taking their material from somewhere else. Nobody thinks differently. They're not pulling the wool over anybody's eyes. They're not a great preacher, but they're at a church of 12 people, and they're great at pastoral ministry, and they're sharing the gospel and bringing people into that church. Not everybody has to be Athanasius or Augustine.
Yeah.
God can use people who need some help when it comes to the task of preaching. They should be working on their sermons. They should be pouring their heart into it, but the capacity is not the same for everybody.
I just want to press on this just a little bit more, because I think some of what we're trying to do here in the Baptist Review is we're trying to ask the questions that critics would ask, but ask them fairly, give you an opportunity to respond. I think people would say, okay, Bart, I agree with you. And I'm not sure I fully agree with you, but this is not a debate between you and me. But let's say we can agree to disagree on some of these things, but maybe, like you said, preaching someone else's experience as your own, that's just wrong.
I haven't defended that. I've never defended that.
And you said it wasn't right, Fred. And yet, Ed is, goes to Southwestern, speaks in chapel. He is still the leader. There's not broad calls from, his side of the convention for him to resign, for him to step down. And so people have asked, well, what if his CBN-supported opponent had defeated him in a pretty close election and done the same thing? Would the response have been the same way? Would we have said, no, you need to resign? I mean, what do you think? Tribalism was part of that, or were there bigger issues at play? How is that shaping? I guess what I'm asking is, what kind of repercussions should there be for what we think is a leader doing something wrong, and how does tribalism shape the way we respond?
Well, that's a great question. I'll say that I think it has to be a very, very grave and serious wrong for the president of the Southern Baptist Convention to step down, because there is no mechanism for the messengers to adjudicate whether it's a serious enough situation for that. And I also don't know the degree to which Southern Baptists, when they vote for the office of first vice president, are saying, we've thoroughly vetted this person to think that they might be someone who becomes president of the Southern Baptist Convention. I think,
and let's be honest, like a third of the messengers vote on the first vice.
Exactly.
I mean, Ed is the president, and then there is a guy.
I say that as a former first vice president of the Southern Baptist Convention. I don't think anybody who elected me as first vice president thought we're doing this because we think Bart's the guy who could step in.
I just think Jay Adkins is a snazzy dresser.
Yeah.
So
did Southern Baptist say, we really think that Wiley Drake should be 2 heartbeats away from being our representative leader?
So
no offense to Wiley.
I'll just say this. If we want to have some clearly stated causes for the removal of the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, let's state what they are clearly in our governing documents, which we have not. And I mean, we had people who stayed on in spite of the fact that they supported the slavery of people who were African Americans. So it's not like we haven't crossed some pretty serious bridges for all of that in the past. I think it's I want to protect the rights of the messengers. The messengers elected that person. I don't think a noisy minority ought to be able to go digging through somebody's personal life or ministerial life in an effort to undo the results of an election. And I would feel the same way if it were somebody I did not vote for. And I'll say this. I mean, I'm working alongside people who are. Philip Robertson has been a member of the Conservative Baptist Network, and
council member,
and he and I work together closely. And I would absolutely oppose anybody's effort to remove him from out of his position.
Amen.
We have a strong, healthy, positive working relationship and friendship, and so it's not about.
And his tenure is not marked by overt partisanship. He's tried to do the job to the best of his ability.
Done a good job.
Like you.
He's done a fabulous job.
Excellent job.
And I'm 100% supportive of him.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Bart, we want to take a break. When we come back, we want to talk about this year's annual meeting and some of the changes that are being made to it and some of the things that you're looking forward to in Indianapolis this year. We'll take a quick break. Hey, listeners. Today, I want to talk to you about something truly special from one of our sponsors, Lifeline Children's Services. Lifeline believes that adoption is a divine calling. It's a way that God provides families for vulnerable children who deserve love and a sense of belonging. You see, Lifeline understands the bigger picture of adoption, that it's a crucial part of God's redemptive purpose. Sadly, with orphan numbers on the rise, there is an urgent need. And so we would ask you today to consider Christ's call to adoption through Lifeline Children's Services. Why Lifeline? Well, they're relational. They build connections with families, partners, and with local churches. And Lifeline is also gospel-centered. They put the love of Christ at the heart of everything that they do. And Lifeline promises to walk with you before, during, and after the adoption. Lifeline's Children's Services Adoptions Program, answering the call to share love, build families, because every child deserves a home. Visit lifelinechild.org/adoption today to learn more and begin your adoption journey. Hey, I just want to take a minute to say something about our sponsor for this episode. The North American Mission Board has been putting out some new podcasts that I'm pretty sure if you're a pastor or a church leader, you're going to find really helpful. Trevin Wax has been doing this documentary-style podcast called Reconstructing Faith. There are 2 seasons out right now. It's super engaging. Trevin is looking at the major challenges facing the church right now. Everything from the anti-institutional ethos of our culture to the phenomenon of de-churching, debates over masculinity, the prevalence of pornography, spiritual burnout, and on and on and on. You can listen to the Reconstructing Faith podcast on whatever podcast platform you prefer, and I'd encourage you to check it out. So Bart, the annual meeting, we talked about this probably in a previous episode, they're all starting to run together. The annual meeting has really seen record numbers these last few years. I mean, it has just exploded, I think, as people have begun to get more involved in the work of the convention, as we've seen more and more things that people are very passionate about.
So I just want to say we'll have to triple our current attendance to get record numbers.
Oh, okay.
But
Well,
they are
increasing numbers.
These are
growing.
precedented times.
Increasing. See, again, the Baptist history. These are precedented times. Increasing numbers from where we were. We've seen an increase. And we expect to see that again this year in Indianapolis already, and just some of the things that we're seeing. And so one of the things just real practically that people have begun to ask is, as travel and food and lodging and just the time, I think really becomes a burden on some churches and some pastors and some messengers. Is there a day coming where remote participation would be a possibility? And in your opinion, is it still imperative that messengers are in the room to do the work of the convention?
I think no technology exists today that I look at and say, when that matures, we'll be able to do remote voting. And yes, I think it's imperative for messengers to come. And I think there are two great examples of that in very recent history, one of them in the Southern Baptist Convention and one of them outside. We had a technology failure in the annual meeting.
Yes.
Where most of the microphones, all the microphones stopped working.
We were both on stage for that.
And most of them stopped working another time. And we were still able to guarantee that everyone had the opportunity to go to a microphone and speak, and that everyone had the opportunity to vote. And you want to talk about eroding trust in the Southern Baptist Convention? Come to something important and have the technology fail, and not everybody's votes get counted. And there's no way to know whether everybody's votes got counted if you're doing remote participation in the annual meeting.
I can't think of an example anywhere in our country where people don't fully trust the results of electronic voting.
So the other option that incident I was going to bring up was the Iowa Democratic what do you call it?
Caucus.
The Iowa Democratic Caucus that moved over to this new computerized remote voting system, and it completely crashed. They did not get results from their election that whole night, and it was a debacle. And so I think when you put yourself in the shoes of the person wielding the gavel, I take my responsibility to the messenger body very seriously. My responsibility is to tell you, if you'll do blank, I will guarantee you, one way or the other, I'm going to extend to the messenger body the opportunity for discussion and voting. And if you are not in that room, I cannot make that guarantee. What I'm really concerned about is that we get to the point that we have some kind of remote voting system that works most of the time. And that's the thing. People say, well, this usually works.
Usually, yeah.
But if you're the person whose job it is to extend that guarantee to people, you want to be able to say it never fails.
60% of the time, it works every time.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
And so my concern is that we say, okay, we're not going to do like full-on remote voting. You can't do this in your pajamas from your basement. But we're going to hold regional meetings
at associational buildings, at churches. Yeah.
So, I mean, the association, do you know how many associational buildings there are?
Not,
roughly a billion.
Thousands upon thousands of them. And so we have 10 microphones and we have trouble managing that. How are you going to get people? And people are going to come out of that and say, well, nobody was able to speak. Our association had 3 people who were waiting to speak.
Live from the Shem Creek Baptist Association.
I've always known Baptist associations to be very forward-thinking on technology and organizing.
That's what I'm saying. But even if it all works, you're at microphone 163.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, right.
Most people are not going to get recognized.
Yeah.
And it's going to be something that really erodes trust whenever that happens. But beyond all of that, even if you decide to do that, some people would look and say, but here are the people who can't come to the big annual meeting who could come to that meeting at their
smaller
association.
meeting. That's what I hear more of, yeah.
But I'm thinking about the person who does go to the annual meeting,
Right.
who decides that year, okay, now I'm not going to do that because I can just go to the county seat and do that. But then the system fails them.
And
they would have had a vote counted, and now they have a vote that's not counted.
We also need to say that the annual meeting is not just a series of successive votes. So much takes place here.
That's good. Griffin.
That binds us in cooperation. What do we all say? The annual meeting is a big family reunion.
It is.
Once we stop seeing each other, stop talking to each other, we are sowing the seeds of fracture when we stop gathering.
Well, we become anonymous. Yeah.
Well, we saw that in COVID when our churches stopped gathering. It frayed the edges of our unity, or maybe not our unity, but just our love for one another, our commitment to one another. To think that won't happen in the SBC if suddenly, as a millennial, people are going to do this in their pajamas. I mean, they're going to find a way to not really connect. We're not really plug in, and you'd have 2,000, 3,000 person conventions, and it would be.
I said a while ago that I thought the affinity groups could be a positive development. That's where the affinity groups are able to exist. You have the Hispanic celebration and the African American fellowship and the Asian American gathering and you have 9 Marks at 9.
Baptist College alumni events.
Baptist 21.
All the seminaries.
Who would travel to seminary events or to Baptist College events or to affinity group events if they had to make a separate trip for all of these things? You do it all in one place.
Even groups I'm not a part of, even if you want to talk about the Conservative Baptist Network, their big meetings at the annual meeting. That's where they are able to get all their people together. And
notably, when they've met in other places, their crowds have been not the same, but they've been packed for the annual meeting.
They have been. And so I just don't think there's really any replacement for being in the room, being there in person.
Yeah. Bart, you've been even before your presidency, you were a huge proponent of the annual meeting. We've just heard reasons for that now. And I know that this is something that you love and your family has been a part of. When was the last time you missed an annual meeting?
Phoenix, not the last time we were in Phoenix, but the time before that when we were in Phoenix.
Okay. All right. I'll have to go back and...
I've missed once in the past 20 years.
Okay. All right. Is there anything about the annual meeting, now that you're president, you get the opportunity to speak into some of what happens at the annual meeting, how that meeting kind of goes, how the days are structured? Is there anything about it that bugs you that you would say, I want to change, would change?
Well, let me first say what bugs me about being the president, okay, and also about being on the resolutions committee and chairing the resolutions committee. It's been
the Festivus episode.
It's been 4 years.
Get the poll.
It's been 4 years since I really got to enjoy the exhibit hall, I love the exhibit hall. And I'm thankful that you only get 2 terms as president because I'm about to run out of ink pens and highlighters and squeeze balls, so I need to get back to where I have some free time to go through the exhibit hall and just.
Last 2 years, we've had the biggest exhibit halls in history.
I know.
We got some good folks running that.
All I can do is talk about it. Who is it who lines that up?
Someone wonderful.
Yes. So it's your wife, and she does an amazing job. But I'll tell you that. One of the things that I'm thankful that we're doing is adding another session this year. You may wind up asking about that later on. I don't know.
No, I think you can answer that.
But the annual meeting this past year was too dense. It's too packed tight with things, and I'll tell you why. And I'll just y'all can decide whether your podcast is rated for having this information in here or not.
Rated B for Bart.
That's right. That's right. So, being human beings, those of us who are conducting the business on the platform occasionally need a bathroom break. And we didn't have panel discussions, and we didn't have theme interpretations, and we didn't have all this extra stuff. We were conducting business pretty much the whole time that we were there. And occasionally our eyeballs were floating in our heads, and we were like, we need to get to a point where somebody sings a song or something. So you
heard it here first.
That's right.
Rated B for bathroom.
That's right. And not only that, but the fact of the matter is, nobody knows what's going to happen in the annual meeting until it happens.
Until it happens, yeah.
And every once in a while, just to know the parliamentary implications or whatever else, you need a moment that I and the parliamentarians can step off the side of the platform and say, what just happened? And how does that affect what we're going to do later on? And so adding another session, I promise you, I'm not going to fill the annual meeting with a bunch of fluff. We're just going to have some breaks in there where we can step down and get a sip of water and maybe run the restroom right quick, and also say the business that we conducted just now, how does that affect the business that we're going to conduct in the next session or whatever. So just a little bit of downtime for the business personality is to get off of this platform.
Well, I think that's not only a benefit for the platform, for those on the platform. I think that's a benefit for the messengers. I think there's great wisdom in sometimes saying we're gonna take a minute and everybody stand at ease and take a deep breath and talk amongst yourselves and get up and stretch, because it can. You're exactly right. And I think in the last several years, but last year in particular, it was very heavy in the room. We were dealing with significant issues and significant things, and it does, whether you know it or not, it takes a toll on every person in the room as those decisions are being made. And so I do think providing a little bit of extra time, providing a little bit of extra breathing room, providing a little bit of extra space, not only for the platform but for the messengers, is a good thing.
One thing I want to ask has to do with entities. This is actually kind of a two-parter here. One of the reasons I think people are advocating for remote voting is because there's been an insinuation or even an accusation at times that entities are putting their thumbs on the scale. They send all of their employees, who also come as messengers of their churches, and they vote. Or NAM has been accused of flying in, thousands of church planters to vote a certain way. Now, there's no evidence given of these things, just accusation made. But then even beyond that, I can just tell you, I worked at an entity as director of communications marketing at Southeastern. When it comes time to register for hotels, everyone should know that one of the reasons it's hard, every single entity who has to be there to do the work that they do, plus the exhibitors, they are on the website waiting for the moment when those hotels open up. Everyone is supposed to register for as many rooms as possible as they can right there in the moment. And then they'll, cover it after the fact. But some people feel like then because of that, well, entities have the good hotels. Entities are coming and voting. So should we change the way that works? I mean, should entity employees maybe be banned from voting? Should we stop our church planners from voting at the convention until they're no longer being funded by an entity to vote? Are those concerns, are those questions legitimate?
I think it absolutely lies within the right of the messenger body to make any of those changes if they choose to do so. I think, though, it's based upon some false premises because as someone who served as a trustee of more than one entity, if you think that everybody who works for an entity agrees with the leadership of that entity, you have not interacted very much with people who work at entities. Now, I'm sure that we could say that every International Mission Board missionary would be someone who would not vote in favor of the abolition of the International Mission Board and the loss of their job. But just because Paul Chitwood thinks something ought to happen does not mean that anybody who's wearing an IMB badge at the booth in the exhibit hall is going to go in and vote exactly the way that they've been instructed to do. We are Baptists. We are an independent lot. And I can just say that the chief problem with conspiracy theories about the Southern Baptist Convention that are an ancient thing that go back a long time is nobody can organize Southern Baptists that well. We are simply too irascible to be people who can be lined up like that. And I think we've probably all experienced employees of entities complaining about leadership of entities too much for us to think that. So if Southern Baptists want to say, hey, if you're a church planner with the North American Mission Board, you can't vote until you're not being supported anymore, it's the right of the messengers to do that.
But also, wouldn't it kind of violate the church's right to send their own messengers, even if they're an employee?
Well, really, unless you're saying if that church is getting support, they can't send messengers at all. And I'm just going to say, I think it's the right of the messengers to make that kind of choice. But if you're making that kind of choice because you're assuming
they're all voting
that they're all a voting
block,
then I think you're really disrespecting the individual personalities and the whole our idea is that you're supposed to pray about these things and let the Spirit of God lead you. And so, how insulting it is to suggest that the people who work for our entities have abandoned that.
And if they can't vote, they can't be messengers. And if they can't be messengers, I can think of 7 or 8 instances in the last 10 years that I've been going and actively engaged with the convention where entity employees have made significant motions and spoken to issues and times when it wasn't altogether clear in a debate what the truth was or what direction we should go in. And it was an entity employee who stood up and said, let me give you some insight into this thing, that without it, the messengers would have been worse off and less informed in their voting, on top of the fact that there really is no way to verify at all who these people are voting for. This is an anonymous ballot.
And I mean, I will say that when I taught Baptist history at Southwestern Seminary, I always gave this instruction to my classes. I said, there are 3 categories of people who are attending the SBC and voting. There are people whose job require them to be there. Whose job requires them. They have to go. They have to be there. They have to vote. There are people whose job will pay for them to be there. That's somebody like me. My church provides a convention travel allowance to me. So my church will cover the cost. Well, my church has never covered all of the costs. There's an amount in our budget that goes toward covering my cost to attend the SBC annual meeting. And but then the other group of people are the people who pay to go. They're paying out of their pocket for a hotel room. They're paying out of their pocket for travel. They're taking time off from their job to go be there. So they're burning up vacation days. And so I'll just say this: I am concerned if the vast preponderance of messengers are made up of Category 1 or even Category 1 and Category 2. But the answer to that is not to exclude people. The answer to that is for churches to make it an important priority to send people to the annual meeting.
When they get to the meeting, what should they expect in terms of reporting and transparency from entities? There has been a complaint, and I'll just tell you, this is my personal complaint, that we sit in the room and listen to marketing pitches. We're not getting real reports. Not all the time. We're not getting transparency about hard decisions. In fact, this year, I know I sat through a report for one of our entities, and then not a month after we got home, there was a major announcement about the shuttering of a service that thousands of Southern Baptist churches use. We didn't hear a word of it at the convention. What does an ideal report, what should we expect from them when we get there?
Well, it's a great question. I do think that it would be better if our entities touched upon substantive issues, especially if they know that things are coming in the pipeline. There is an opportunity for people to ask questions, but a lot of times people are not informed enough to know which questions they should ask or want to ask. I will say this year, everybody who wanted to ask a question got to ask a question. I don't think we shut the time off much at all if we did it all during the question time. And in fact, the same question got asked over and over again of a lot of the entity leaders because there was room for people to come ask whatever they wanted to ask.
Is that a problem, the sort of hijacking of our Q&A for pet issues that really have nothing to do with that entity's mission?
It's not a problem. It's just an unintended consequence of our polity. And I'll keep the polity even if it has unintended consequences. I think some groups use the annual meeting to recruit. They'll do something that 13,000 of the 14,000 people roll their eyes at. But if 1,000 of those people are really interested in what they're doing, that's a big recruiting day for them. Yeah. So
cameras and microphones on the floor, loading up mics to ask the same questions. It's pretty transparently obvious.
Any cure would be worse than the disease. So
that's good.
So I want us to leave those microphones open for people to come and ask things. I do think that in terms of reporting, I think the complaint you're making is understandable. It's a real one. I've felt that way myself sometimes in the past. It is marketing to some degree, but I'll just say this. we are not dying from a lack of inspiration, or we're not dying from too much inspiration to try to get people to buy into the vision of what our entities are doing. And I think we might have to do less marketing if we were in a spot where we just talked earlier about Southern Baptist education in another episode where Rob Collingsworth was asking me, how are we going to accomplish all of this? And so in a day and time where nobody else can be counted on in local churches to tell the stories of these entities and why they deserve support, I think it maybe is a pretty good priority for them to say, hey, instead of telling you about footnote 4 on the financial statement, we'd like to tell you why we exist and what we're trying to do, so you would know why we would be supportive. I think
a good mix.
I think we should accomplish both things. Part of the way, the last thing I'll say is this: a lot of the things that people come and say, we're never told about blank, is actually printed in the SBC annual that is published every year after the meeting. And not very many people go look at it.
I had a college professor, and you've probably seen this, had a T-shirt that just said, it's in the syllabus.
Yeah.
You know, it's like a lot of the questions that you're at, it's there if you know where to look. It's just finding where to look.
A lot of people don't know that every entity is audited every year, and the results of the audit are printed in the SBC annual every year.
Bart, I want to kind of wrap this interview with one kind of final question. Obviously, we're leading up to Indianapolis, a couple months away from the annual meeting in Indianapolis, and there are lots of big things that are happening there. We've talked about constitutional amendments. I know there are 2 presidential appointed task force that are going to bank their reports on top of all of the other entity reports and things that are happening. If there's a pastor listening, a Southern Baptist, a messenger listening, who's kind of right now maybe on the fence. Maybe they're just going, I want to go, but I've got some other things that, you know, are kind of, it could take priority in the summer. And should I go? How would you encourage just Southern Baptist or Southern Baptist pastor or leader or somebody to come to the annual meeting in Indianapolis and maybe even encourage them in what attitude to approach our meeting with?
This is the most important election in the history of the universe. No, I'm sorry.
Until next year.
That's what everybody says every year, right? You have to participate because this is the most important one. Let me just tell you why it is. When Bart's not president, why he goes every year to the annual meeting.
Good. Yeah.
Okay. The first and foremost reason is this. First Baptist Farmersville, if we kept the money that we sent through the cooperative program, could hire 2 more staff members onto our staff, at least. And if I had 2 staff members, I would look in on what they were doing at least once a year to have some kind of input in the decisions that they're making or to examine the things that they're doing. And so, you know, if your church gives $50 a year through the cooperative program, it's probably harder for me to make the case. But if you are engaged in the cooperative work of the Southern Baptist Convention, then it is a good investment for you to come to the annual meeting, to have the opportunity to be informed and to have your say. And beyond all of that, it is just an amazing opportunity for fellowship and growth. And even if you come year 1 and you don't really know anybody, by year 2 you can, and you meet other people who are similarly situated to you, and you create friendships there that can last for a long time. And I said, you know, it'd be different if we were over-inspired, but I say it would also be different if we're over-connected. But consistently, pastors are reporting that they're isolated and lonely.
Lonely, yeah.
Reporting that they wish they had peers who could encourage them and speak into their life. And I'll tell you, if there's anything that we can say conclusively after a couple of decades of messing around with it, it's that interacting with somebody on a social media platform does not fill whatever void it is that you have in your heart for that.
That's right on.
It's got to be something that you do in person with people. This struck home to me in my mom's latter days of her Alzheimer's and her illness, where we had an iPad set up with FaceTime, and she wouldn't even pay attention to it. But if you showed up in her room, you had her complete attention, and she was delighted that you were there. There is something deep in your brain, deep in the way that God made you, that needs to interact person on person with people. And so if you're lonely and isolated as a pastor, make an effort to come to this meeting where you can sit beside people like you and maybe have a chance to make a connection and go to some of the breakout meetings.
Conference.
Yeah.
Be encouraged.
Be encouraged by what happens at the pastor's conference, the singing. Man, I was so blessed by James Cheeseman and the worship that we had this last year.
The prayer room, if you need it.
The prayer room is there if you need it. You can,
huge ministry.
And if you want to pray for somebody else, man, go to the IMB booth, go to the NAM booth, meet some of the people who are on the tip of the spear for Southern Baptists. And I just think it's not just about voting on something. It's not just a political caucus. I think it'll do your heart and your spirit good to come to the annual meeting.
Bart, we are so thankful for your leadership and for the time that you've given us to answer, I think, hard questions, but necessary questions and good questions. Really, I know that I've been blessed by our friendship and have been blessed by our conversation here on the Baptist Review. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Baptist Review podcast. The Baptist Review is committed to helping facilitate better conversation towards a better convention. For more information about the Baptist Review, you can check out our website, thebaptistreview.com.